In our previous lesson, we talked about the integration that we can have with ACI in our third-party devices. There's two different ways that we integrate with layer 4 through 7 devices. Our two modes called managed and unmanaged. Managed allows us to fully integrate with that device and even do some automation and orchestration with that layer 4 through 7 device. We have many vendors that are working with ACI that have developed what we call a device package. What that means is that the vendors have downloaded our SDK, which is open and free, and developed a package to be able to integrate with ACI in a very complete manner. Basically, with this device package, ACI can interact with the device, it can negotiate connectivity with the device, it can take the interfaces that we're going to use, it can configure the interfaces, and in regards to a firewall, for instance, it can actually push the policy to the firewall and configure the firewall for you. It can add the firewall rules. And while you're using the firewall, it will automatically monitor those rules to make sure they stay intact. And when you're done with that application and you delete the configuration from the network, the controller goes back in and it removes that configuration from the firewall. It gives you your resources back and it stops sending traffic there. We can do this with firewalls, we can do this with load balancers, we can do this with many vendors out there. And it's not just Cisco devices. There's device packages for Palo Alto, there's device packages for Checkpoint, there's device packages for F5, there's device packages for Citrix. The list goes on and on. What this means is I can define a standard for how end users are allowed to talk to my web servers. And I can create a template. And I can make sure that when somebody configures the network that they're always using a known good template over and over again, and they're not going to make human error when they're trying to configure the firewall. And they're always adhering to my corporate policy because they're reusing the template over and over again. It helps me with orchestration and automation because now I don't have to program my orchestration and automation tool to interact with the firewall because ACI does that automatically for me based on the policy that I define. Now there's some companies that maybe haven't developed a device package, or there's some companies that say, you know what, we've got a separate security team, or I don't feel good about letting ACI just make configurations willy-nilly to my firewall. And in that case, we have what we call an unmanaged device. This still makes it much easier to send the traffic to the device and do the configuration inside of the APIC. As a matter of fact, it's still checking a box and it's still dragging and dropping inside of a policy. But I don't reach into the device and do any configuration. The other question I get asked a lot is, what happens if ACI is controlling some configuration on my firewall and my network engineer goes in and makes a change? Well, ACI, if it's a managed device, always wins for the configuration that it's controlling. So basically, it logs back in and changes that configuration back. So you always want to let ACI in manage mode manage a particular configuration. Or in some cases, people will assign certain virtual firewalls just to ACI and allow their administrators to configure other firewalls. Or if it's a device that can be virtually divided up into separate tenants or contexts, they'll assign ACI to a context and then use other contexts for the administrator to manage. Or, as I mentioned before, if that's going to be a problem, we may just use unmanaged mode. So just to clarify what a device package is, a device package is a set of files that the vendor of that device creates in order to let ACI interact with it. So in this case, for instance, it's an XML file that contains a device specification that tells us what that device is capable of. The second part of that device package are scripts, Python scripts, allowing ACI to interact with that device. So this package is actually not developed by us. It's developed and maintained by the vendors that developed the device package and is updated on a regular basis. The controller will then use the CLI or the programming interface on the device to interact with it and control the configuration. So as you can see, this is a very powerful system. And this is just one of the ways that you can use ACI to reduce complexity in your network, streamline your deployments, reuse known good policy, and have more visibility into your applications even when you're using your layer 4 through 7 services. Now that we've learned how to manage third-party devices with ACI, let's take a look at what it looks like to configure this in the actual console. So here I've logged into my ACI. I'm actually already in my tenant. I've already created an application. I have two groups here, my web servers and my database servers. And if I want to bring layer 4 through 7 services into the picture between my web servers and my database servers, or any communication between my web servers and my database servers, I control all that through a contract. Here I'm going to drag a contract down, and I'm going to associate my web servers with my database servers with the contract. Now I'm going to go ahead and give my contract a name, and I'm going to call this Secure Database Communication. Well, there's one thing to note here. Towards the top you'll see that we use this naming convention called consumer and provider. Now that actually controls the direction in which you're applying the filters if you're using a one-directional filter. In this case, we're actually using a bidirectional filter, so it doesn't matter as much. We're actually not going to use any filter at all because we're actually going to have the firewall doing the filtering. But how this works is that the provider would be the device providing services. So for instance, a web server would provide port 80 and 443 to its customers. In this case, with this contract, the provider would actually be the database. And so if I highlight this, I can see that in this case the provider is the web server, and I want it to switch around so that the provider is actually the database servers. So now when I highlight the top again, I can see that the provider is the database servers and the devices consuming the services is actually the web servers. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to bring in a layer 4 through 7 device. So I simply check this box that says configure layer 4 through 7 device or service graph. I click next, and in this case I have a device that's already configured. It's an ASA or a virtual ASA. Once again, these devices can be either managed devices or unmanaged devices. The managed devices have a device package, and I'm actually going to do some orchestration on the firewall. The unmanaged devices, I'm literally just telling it which interfaces that the firewall is plugged into and where to send the traffic. I'm not going to do any type of configuration. In order to configure this firewall, what I have to do is I just drag my firewall that's already available over here and let it go. Now I have it in line to the communication between the web servers and the database servers. As you can see, this is much easier than what I've done in the past. I give it a name, ASA Firewall. I tell it whether it's going to be a routed or a transparent firewall. And then if I'm pushing configuration to the firewall, which I am because this is managed mode, then I choose a template for that configuration. In this case, my company has already defined a template for me that says that if you're going to use transparent mode firewall and you're going to be filtering between a web server, you want to choose this template. I then pick the interface on the firewall that is the inside or the outside interface. And in this case, the web servers are the outside interface, and the provider or the database server is going to be our inside interface. I then click next, and it's going to actually show me the parameters that is pushing to the firewall so I can double check and make sure they're right. Here I can see I'm applying an access list, and yep, that's good for me. So I'm going to press OK, and I'm basically done. I press submit, and now the APIC is going to log into that firewall. It's going to negotiate VLANs. It's going to configure interfaces. It's going to add an ACL. It's going to make sure that ACL stays in place for the whole time that this application is up and running. If I delete this contract because I don't want to use it anymore, it's going to log back into that device. It's going to remove the filters. It's going to unconfigure the interfaces. It's going to take back the VLANs and the configuration, and your resources get put back where they belong. So it's that easy to bring in a layer 4 through 7 device when I want to talk between, for instance, my web servers and my database servers and have the firewall do the filtering for me. This concludes Lesson 9.